Chicago, Illinois, 1871. A time where the city's economy and opportunism was reaching its climactic point, where many U.S. citizens and immigrants created new businesses and live in safe neighborhoods so people can attend a job, earn a living, and support a family. However, on October 8th, the city unexpectedly burst into flames, creating a massive devastation of burning buildings and taking the lives of hundreds of Chicago residents. This event is known as the Great Chicago Fire. Considered one of the largest disasters in U.S. history, the Great Fire was one of the most appalling events that happened in Chicago's history. But did this fire alone create an opportunity to embellish and enhance the city's image and make it what it is today?
It did help Chicago reorganize itself. You know, the area that we're standing in right now, right in the heart of the commercial district, in 1871 it was a mixture of commercial buildings alongside, old-time residences. Like, people lived alongside factories, they lived alongside office buildings and things were all mixed together. And after the fire, they were able to kind of reformulate how neighborhoods and how the city was being used. So rather than putting residences in the area that we're standing in right now in downtown, it really grew up as a commercial center, and the residences were pushed out to other neighborhoods.
One could see this fire as sort of an urban renewal project. In a way, it burned down a lot of bad buildings. It burned down a lot of beautiful buildings too, but it burned down a lot of bad buildings. And it gave an opportunity to redevelop the Loop and expand it, actually. It moved working class and lower class families out of the Loop. It pushed them out. And the Loop really was no longer a place to live, and that it didn't become a place to live until over 100 years later again.
Despite popular belief, the Great Chicago Fire was not started by a cow in Catherine O'Leary's barn when she knocked a lantern over. Michael Ahern, a Republican reporter, fabricated this tale because he believed that it would be a clever story for the newspapers.
The legend that had always been told early in Chicago's history was that Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicked over a lantern, started a fire in the stable that then burned through the neighborhood kind of on the southwest side of downtown. The cow has been exonerated by the city council, so that the cow is no longer blamed for the fire.
The fires bring out the dark side of societies. Those kinds of crises, those kinds of disasters bring out the dark sides. They bring out the prejudices. They bring out the things that people fear. For instance, the fire was blamed on Mrs. O'Leary. And why was it blamed on a working class woman? It was blamed on a working class woman because the West Side was full of immigrants, and it was seen as strange. It was seen as exotic. One begins to, if you follow the newspapers thereafter, you see a lot of anti-Irish feeling in the country, a lot of anti-immigrant feeling.
The fire emerged northeastward. The intensity of the fire was so empowering, it produced extremely strong winds and heat, which ignited rooftops.
Remember, the city was made out of wood. It had wooden sidewalks. In some cases, it had wooden streets. It was a tinderbox, and it exploded in flames that night, and moved very quickly. There's a little river, Chicago's river is a small river. It was easy for the flames to jump across because the winds were pushing the flames at such a high speed.
It was very devastating to downtown Chicago. The entire city did not burn. It was mostly the downtown area stretching all the way up to Lincoln Park burned. Thousands of acres burned.
Firefighters' tactics of extinguishing the fire failed, and the city's water supply was destroyed. Burning fiery flames ravished the city's hotels, department stores, theaters, churches, and City Hall. As the fire headed north, it dismantled mansions while residents found refuge in Lincoln Park and the shores of Lake Michigan. On one Monday night, rain and wind miraculously propelled the flames away, and the Great Fire was finally over, leaving the city and its people feeling helpless.
Its impact saw the entire downtown district devastated. And something like 11 insurance companies went out of business. Something like 16,000 buildings burned down in the fire. One of the things that kept Chicago going afterwards was the fact that all the deeds and the leases, etc., were preserved in the basement of a building downtown, so that people knew their land. They could figure out what land was owned by who.
Eventually, fire ecologists figured that 73 miles of roads, 120 miles of sidewalks, 2,000 lampposts, and 17,500 buildings were destroyed in the fire, exceeding the amount of damage Napoleon did when he seized Moscow in 1812. The 300,000 residents that once flourished the land were also affected, leaving 90,000 people homeless. Surprisingly, only 125 bodies were found after the fire.
It was not a huge loss of life, despite the fact that Chicago was a heavily populated place at the time. Only a couple hundred people, they think, lost their lives. So despite the massive amount of the city that was burned, it wasn't a huge loss of human life.
Some of Chicago's officials revised the city's fire standards, and as a result of the new codes, Chicago now holds some of the most effective fire procedures. The fire may have ruined the city itself, but its residents did not allow the fire to ruin their spirits. Considering most of downtown Chicago was destroyed, new ideas to make the city original was now an option.
The immediate post-fire buildings were rather short-lived. Many of them were later knocked down for what we now call the Chicago School of Architecture.
The architects that developed the Chicago schools were the first to experiment with steel frame construction. John Wellborn Root Sr. and Daniel Burnham, designers of the Montauk Building, began implementing steel frames and terracotta skin in the mid-1890s.
Prior to the 1880s and the advent of steel frame construction using a metal frame instead of brick upon brick, stone upon stone construction, allowed buildings to go much higher. So it wasn't necessarily the spirit or the interest of the architects. They just physically couldn't build much higher with the existing technologies. But once things like steel frame construction came about, they were able to build much taller buildings.
Author of Devil in the White City, Eric Larson, acknowledged Burnham's and Root's accomplishments by stating, "Montauk became the first building to be called a skyscraper."
The reason Burnham is remembered mostly is because he became the most important urban planner in the country. Burnham helped plan the 1893 World's Fair, and in 1909 he set up the Chicago Plan. And those became very, very important nationally.
The Great Chicago Fire was a disaster for the Windy City. Beautiful buildings were destroyed. Lives were lost. But through it all, a silver lining was found. Chicago was able to reinvent itself, creating beautiful architecture that the city is now known for. As Chicago continues to grow, its skyline grows with it. In the end, the Great Chicago Fire put an end to a lot of what the city was, but more importantly, it gave birth to a better and brighter Chicago.